Hey friend, Chris Vandeviver here from WhyLogicProRules.com, the website that helps you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Today I want to share with you a technique that I use for just about every mix when it comes to mixing bass, whether it's a bass guitar or a synth or an 808. And if you struggle with mixing bass, I think this could help. Now, bass is one of those instruments that are infinitely difficult to mix, right? It's one of the top ones that are so difficult. And that's because bass frequencies are not easy to distinguish, they take up a lot of space, and they're often conflicting with other low-end instruments. And so this technique has helped me a lot through the years for balancing bass and just kind of stabilizing levels. That, to me, is the hardest part about mixing. If you really break it down, mixing in a nutshell is managing the levels of tracks and also the levels of frequencies and the dynamics, and it's just all about levels. And what makes mixing difficult in this department is the fact that levels don't only change from the performance perspective, where this note maybe was performed louder than this note, but also frequencies are adapting and changing and moving around the spectrum. So a resonance at a particular moment might be really loud and really obnoxious, while another moment it's not even present. So how do we manage all of this? Well, we use dynamic processors to rein things in. And that's always my goal, is to tighten and rein in dynamics and performance so I can actually hear what kind of EQing I need to commit to my tracks. And taking all of this into mind, bass tracks are notorious for being really loud at one moment, really quiet at the next, and just trying to manage the dynamics of such an important instrument that's not, again, easy to discern, but needs to take up a lot of space. So this technique, I think, can be of real help. Now, before we dig into what I've done, let's take a listen to the bass in this session. I have a bass guitar track here. We're going to listen from the end of the chorus into the verse. We'll listen through the verse just because there's not a lot of instrumentation at this moment. So it's drums, guitars, vocals, not a lot. Take a listen, take some notes on what you think of the bass, and then we'll listen to the original bass before I did any sort of processing. Take a listen.
They left their homes, they had no fear, headed north to the last frontier, in search of the dream we call Alaska. They raised the kids and they taught them right, from the land just to earn the right to be called real Alaskan. Oh, where the land ends and the sea begins, while it's calling that.
Okay, so, just gather your thoughts. We're going to go back to the original version, and probably what I should have started with to begin with. But this is the level match the best I could, the bass guitar before any processing. Take a listen, and we'll compare.
They left their homes, they had no fear, headed north to the last frontier, in search of the dream we call Alaska. They raised the kids and they taught them right, from the land just to earn the right to be called real Alaskan. Oh, where the land ends and the sea.
Okay, and then we'll just do a quick back and forth. So I'm going to zoom in here, and I'll play it, and we'll hear the original bass, and then I'll swap to the mixed bass.
They left their homes, they had no fear, headed north to the last frontier, in search of the dream we call Alaska. They raised the kids and they taught them right, from the land just to earn the right to be called real Alaskan. Oh.
Okay, kind of hard to flip back and forth, but you get what I mean. Now, in my opinion, the original bass is good. There's nothing terrible about it. It has a nice low end. Sometimes it's a little too much low end, and it has articulation, but oftentimes the articulation kind of disappears. Sort of like tipped very much in the low direction. And we want our bass to have a lot of low end content. We want it to be sturdy in that department, but we need articulation. We need, not really top end, but upper mids, mid range to feel stable as well, so we can perceive and hear the bass in the mix. So the way I like to mix basses, and again, synth, guitar, 808, whatever, is I like to duplicate the bass track. So I'll take the bass track and just duplicate it using the button right here, or using Command D, or to make things even faster, just hold Option, click, and drag, and there we have it with the content as well. And then I like to name each bass track bass low and bass high. And I use a linear EQ in hopes of preserving any phase between these two tracks. I don't want to cause phase shift because that could be a problem. So I use the linear phase EQ. And on the low track, I set a low pass filter to about 200 hertz, but it all depends on what sounds best to your ears. I'm trying to isolate just the low end on the low track. And then on the high track, I'm bringing a high pass filter into the equation using the linear phase EQ up to the same frequency. And I'm trying to isolate just the mid-range and the high end if there is any high end. And so we have a low part of the bass and a high. And if we listen to each, just take a quick listen. And then the high. And this gives us both, the full picture of the bass. Okay, so at this point, we now have two levers. If we open the mixer, we have two levers for the low and the high, so we can balance the two against each other. In this case, I actually boosted the low end by a dB. But now we're able to mix both the low and the high end of the bass separate from one another. Kind of like multi-band compression, but this, in my opinion, is even easier. At this point, my goal is to basically dynamically squash both the low end and the high end and then balance the two. And the way I did this in this particular case is I used a compressor. I set it to the Studio FET on the low side of the bass. And the Studio FET is modeled or, inspired by an 1176, so it's pretty quick in its response. And I've got it set to just 4-1, but it's taken off anywhere between 5 to 10 dB on the low end. And I'm just wanting it to rein in that low end so it's very stable as best as I can get it. And then in this particular case, I actually use some distortion on the low end, which I would never use, generally speaking. Can't say never, but generally wouldn't use distortion on the low end because we want to preserve the low end and keep it clean. But it just felt like that the overdrive, which is a great plugin for subtle harmonic information that you want to add to a track, it's not squashing the bass with distortion. It's not super distorted on the low end, but it's just kind of further compressing in a gentle way. And then at that point, on the high end, I'm surprised I'm not using a compressor on the high end. Instead, I'm using a bit crusher and the distortion plugin. So I'm basically using two distortions to really squash the mids and the high end. And I don't ever use the bit crusher. That's actually why I picked using it, just to give it a try, and it actually gave me something that I was pretty stoked on. And if we once again listen to the mixed bass against the original bass, take a listen. You get more of the low end and the high end. It seems more holistic. It doesn't feel so slanted to one side. And then it just really is more present in the mix. And in fact, if we introduce the drums into the mix, and then we'll solo between the two so we get some context of what's going on. Okay, and let's compare. And once again. And now the bass feels so much more stable in the mix. It's really so pleasing to work this way. You have much more freedom to compress one aspect of the bass, to bring out certain elements of it. And really, again, because frequencies and performance, etc., are constantly changing in terms of their level, in this case, you can really smash both the low end and the high end with compression, with distortion. And it doesn't sound like it's straining under the weight of heavy compression. Again, I think this makes bass way easier to mix. And it's not like that the processing stopped there. In fact, on the track stack for this low and high bass, I applied some EQ, again, compression, even some of the sub bass. And, I was able to stabilize the level of the low and the high and then treat the bass more holistically once I reined in these two elements of the bass track. And again, in context, it's just pretty satisfying to hear the bass just like not wiggling around as it was.
I had no fear, headed north to the last frontier, in search of the dream we call Alaska.
Pretty cool, right? So I hope this was helpful for you. If it was, as always, I highly recommend subscribing to the YouTube channel, Why Logic Pro Rules, or subscribing on the website itself, whylogicprorules.com. Every week I'm posting new videos, new emails, and posts to help you get the most you can out of Apple's Logic Pro. Thanks so much.